Okay. Good afternoon and welcome to this policy dialogue on Crimea, 7 years after Russian annexation and occupation. I'm delighted that the EPC had the opportunity to organize this event in cooperation with the mission of Ukraine to NATO. I would like to start by thanking Georgy Tolkachov, Chargé d'Affaires of the mission of Ukraine to NATO, and his colleague, First Secretary Dr. Natalia Melnik, for their kind assistance with the organization of this event. It's hard to believe that 7 years has already passed since Russia carried out its illegal land grab, massively violating international law. Today, the peninsula is a very different place to what it was 7 years ago. Unfortunately, it has become a black hole for human rights. This includes illegally detained citizens of Ukraine who are held under politically motivated charges, both in Crimea and Russia. We will be hearing more on this topic from one of our speakers shortly. The military buildup on and around Crimea, not least in the Azov Black Sea region, is also extremely worrying, threatening European security. Today's event is going to be looking at the current situation on the ground in Crimea, the policies of the EU and also of the US, the impact of the sanctions that have been placed on Russia, if there's been any impact at all, really, and examine in more detail the establishment of the International Crimean Platform, among other topics. I think we're really lucky today because we have an excellent panel of speakers that are comprising officials, experts, and practitioners who are going to delve into this topic. I want to briefly introduce them all before we go into the debate. First of all, from Ukraine, I'm really delighted that we have Mrs. Emine Dzhaparova, who is first Deputy Foreign Minister of Ukraine. Welcome to you. We also have Anatolii Petrenko, who was Deputy Minister of Defense of Ukraine for European integration. Welcome to you too. From the European Parliament, Mr. Andrius Kubilius, who's head of the EuroNest and a member of the Parliament. Welcome to you too. From the United States, we're very glad to welcome Rachel Denber, who was Deputy Director of Europe and Central Asia Division of Human Rights Watch. I'm also very pleased to have with us today James Appathurai, and I hope I pronounced that correctly, Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs and Security Policy and NATO Secretary General Special Representative for the Caucasus and Central Asia. And last but certainly not least, Joanna Hosa, who is Deputy Director of the Wider Europe Programme at the European Council of Foreign Relations. So we have a long speaker list, but a really top quality speaker list, and I'm sure we're going to have an excellent discussion today. But I would like to start by giving the floor to Deputy Minister Petrenko to kick us off. The floor is yours, sir.
Madam Chair, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for a wonderful introduction. And thank you for having me to this policy discussion, allowing this way to present Ministry of Defense views on current security situation in and around Crimea, mostly from the military point of view. And of course, focusing your attention on the continued militarization of the peninsula by the Russian Federation. Just a week ago, in fact, I spoke on exactly the same topic for the OSCE, and the substance and the passion of the discussion lead me to recognize that the topic is very hot, very relevant, and very much demanding among international community, among decision makers. And it is exactly why, and it justifies the effort of Ukraine to establish the Crimean Platform, which is currently being in the process to prepare the inauguration event soon in August of this year in Ukraine, as we plan to celebrate the 30th anniversary of our independence. To make this initiative a success, Ministry of Defense works very closely in concert with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in particular with Madam Emine Dzhaparova, who's very frankly is tireless motion engine behind this process, for which we all, Emine, thank you very much. But let me turn to the agenda and to things which I assume you might expect purely from Ministry of Defense, from me. And let me talk a little bit about the militarization of the peninsula and our assessment of the situation, how it stands, and how it will go in foreseeable future. From our perspective, since 2008, the Kremlin has been markedly intensifying its policy and actions aimed to bring under Russia's control the whole Black Sea region. Under the occupation and attempted annexation of Crimea, Russia has significantly expanded its domination in the Black Sea and even the Sea of Azov. 7 years ago, as you rightly mentioned, occupation of Crimea was followed by the direct military aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine. Further seizure of additional parts of Ukrainian territory in Donbas has drastically changed the scale and the threats affecting the Black Sea region as well. As a result, all of these aggressive actions of Russian Federation have led to a disruption of the balance of power and termination of the existing security cooperation formats, thus producing new range of threats of both military and non-military nature. As you might be well aware, during the last decade, Russia itself has been advancing its military superiority, challenging NATO on the territories of the so-called traditional Russian influence. We all witness that year by year, Russia increases the number and scale of combat training activities around Ukrainian borders specifically. Our assessments clearly show that forces built up by the Russian Federation for conceptually offensive military exercises can potentially be used to conduct unpredictable escalatory actions emanating from the Crimea and posing threats to the stability of the whole Black Sea region. In fact, Kremlin has been turning the occupied Crimea into a powerful military outpost. Moscow already created a formidable military formation in the Crimean Peninsula of more than 32,000 military personnel. By 2025, the number of Russian troops in Crimea and the number of armaments and military equipment is expected to be further increased. Russia has significantly reinforced its air component, additionally deploying all types of aviation, bomber, assault, fighter, and close aviation support. Existing major airfields in Crimea, such as Gvardiysky and Belbek, are currently suitable for operating strategic long-range bombers. All developed capabilities allow Russia to create air, anti-access, and anti-denial zones, strengthened with surface and subsurface surveillance information system. I would also like to draw your attention to the fact that Crimea's infrastructure is being prepared for potentially storing nuclear weapons. This way, creating preconditions for violating internationally recognized non-proliferation regime. The presence of nuclear munitions in the peninsula may spark, in fact, a whole array of complex political, legal, and moral problems. One should especially keep in mind that the world community has largely held firm in condemning Russia's seizure of Crimea and considers Crimea to be purely Ukrainian territory. Should Russia bring nuclear weapons down there, it will be violating nuclear non-proliferation treaty in a fundamental manner. Ukraine, NATO, and the European Union are all deeply concerned over the increased combat capabilities of the Russian naval component, primarily over the deployment of 13 carriers of caliber type cruise missiles. As of today, the total number of missiles in one salvo is 92, and according to intelligence reports, by 2025, it can be doubled. Actually, by militarizing Crimea and Peninsula, Russia seeks to gain full control of the Black Sea basin. The Kremlin demonstrates its military powers to NATO and increases pressure on Ukraine, and let me highlight here, and other regional countries pursuing European and Euro-Atlantic policy. On a regular basis, Russia deliberately violates air borders of the Black Sea countries, testing their air defense capabilities. Russian aviation makes a simulation of cruise missile launches targeting NATO ships in the Strait of Bosporus and naval bases in the Black Sea. I cannot but mention the fact that conducting naval exercises in the Black Sea imposes significant restrictions and blocks important trade routes in international waters, causing economic losses to all countries in the region. Under the pretext of naval exercises, Russian Navy always creates multiple denial zones. In some cases, the total area of them is almost a quarter of the whole Black Sea basin. In the second half of the last year only, Russian Federation carried out the series of large-scale military exercises in the region. In the very beginning of last September, they conducted special exercise of the Black Sea Fleet and airborne troops with involvement of transport aviation. The aim of the exercise was to demonstrate their ability to carry out landing and air assault operations to destroy NATO ships and to block Black Sea straits. It was followed by the active phase of strategic land post exercise Caucasus in the last decade of the same months. Reportedly, 80,000 contingent was involved in the exercise. More than 12,000 troops additionally took part in all kinds of special preparatory activities, snap inspections, and other activities within the framework of this exercise. Those maneuvers seriously aggravated security situation in the region and posed direct military threat to Ukraine, especially from the occupied Crimea direction. Ladies and gentlemen, just to illustrate you how massive the event was, I'd like to give you some figures. Russian military armada consisted of 50 combat ships, 5 submarines, 250 helicopters, 300 aircraft, 250 armored combat vehicles, and about 450 main battle tanks. Having said that, I'd like to simply suggest you to switch on the imagination, because it all exceeds the whole combat potential of such a respective member state of the European Union as Spain, and it is slightly less than possessed by Italy. Let me give you another perspective. Here's the comparison with some countries in the Black Sea region. Forces and assets of Russian Federation involved in the exercise Caucasus were larger than the armed forces of Romania, Bulgaria, and Georgia combined. It is also worth mentioning that Russia's actions in the Black Sea basin go far beyond the region. In November of last year, for the first time ever, Russia conducted in the northeastern part of the Black Sea combined exercise with Egyptian Navy called Bridge of Friendship. During the exercise, they openly demonstrated to all Black Sea basin their readiness to defend Russian interests in the region by force. In addition, they exercised the formation of a coalition, which could potentially be used to project Russian-led force onto the crisis regions, for example, the Middle East. Having gained the legal control over Crimea, Russia poses not only military but also global threats for the region. Given the ecosystem of the peninsula is unique and extremely sensitive to human impact, militarization negatively impacts the environment of both the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea. Construction of new military bases and expansion of existing ones, realization of huge infrastructure projects, all have negative impact on the rare flora and fauna. Uncontrolled deployment of weapons, increased number of military trainings with military equipment involved have significantly affected Crimea's ecosystem, polluting the territory and coastal zone with propellant and oil products. Militaristic policy of Russian occupation has already reduced the region's resources and in the medium term will have unforeseen consequences for the environment. Madam Chair, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, I want you to have no doubt that Crimea is Ukraine. These words are also in the headline of the statement by the President of the United States of America, Joe Biden, issued on February 26th of this year. The same message is also in the statements of the European Union, the Nato, the OSCE, the United Kingdom, Canada, Japan, and many other countries and institutions. We are grateful to all partners which share this undisputed fact, take consolidated position in condemning and deterring Moscow illegal actions, and keep pressure on Russia by all possible means and ways, including sanctions regime, with the aim to return Crimea to Ukraine and the Kremlin into the framework of international law. With that, I stop. Thank you very much for your attention and remaining online should there be any question to be addressed from the military point of view.
Thank you very much, Deputy Minister Petrenko, for this presentation, which I have to say was quite depressing and also very, very worrying. And I do believe there's many points that you raised that we will be able to come back to later in the discussion, particularly relating to the, the international response to this huge Russian military buildup on and around Crimea. So we'll come back to that shortly. But now I would like to hand the floor directly to your colleague, to Madam Emine Dzhaparova, to hear your comments. I think you have a few slides that you would like to show, so you would need to share your screen with us, please, Madam.
Thank you, dear Madam Moderator. I will obviously do that as soon as I will go with my presentation. But first of all, let me express my huge gratitude for our great team of the Mission of Ukraine to NATO and the European Policy Center for organizing this event, as it is actually lays within our tactical aim to keep the Crimean issue on the surface of international attention and agenda, which is, of course, year by year, objectively becomes very challenging. And let me also thank you, a great colleague of mine, Anatolii Petrenko, for really giving his great contribution to all of our MFA of efforts in terms of raising the awareness of what Crimea is today, not only in terms of human rights violations, but probably the gravest concern that we have is the militarization and the threat of security and defense, not only to the Black Sea region, but to the wider region of countries, including European countries. And also very happy to see Andrius and James, whom I was honored to meet during my last visit to Brussels just a month ago with my Prime Minister. And of course, Rachel and Joanna, I hope that your contribution will always also be great and strong in terms of informing our partners what Crimea is today and what is the perspective and what the response can be, because I believe that this is a common effort. We have to jointly seek for the response that sometimes, and the questions, to answer the questions that are very difficult to answer. What should we do with the occupation? How can we deal with a bunch of the consequences that we see every day? And unfortunately, 15th of March Today, we, let's say, mark the anniversary of the death of the first of the Crimean Tatar victim of the occupation, Rishat Mietov, who was a 30-year-old man, father of 3 children, who was a one-man picketer, who spent a couple of hours in the central square of Simferopol with, let's say, slogans, pro-Ukrainian slogans, and he was taken by the so-called self-defense guys into unknown direction. He was stolen 3rd of March 2014, and we found him 15th of March 2014, and we found him tortured, of course, and this is also a depressing fact, but something that we have to deal with, unfortunately, on an everyday basis. So let me go to my presentation. The idea of this presentation is to actually brief you a little bit of what technically and how does our initiative, the Crimea Platform, looks like in terms of 3 pillar mission aims, I would say. So the Crimea Platform and its philosophy lays within 3 pillars, which is about strategy, consolidation, and synergy. Speaking about the strategy, I'm also very happy to stress that just a couple of days ago, the Defense and Security Council of Ukraine adopted the strategy of Ukraine on the occupation and reintegration of Crimea, saying that our ultimate goal and the goal of Ukraine is full deoccupation and reintegration of Crimea under the let's say, to restore the sovereignty of Ukraine in Crimea. Several measures in different spheres are envisaged in this strategy, like legal, information, administrative and territorial policy, economic, humanitarian, foreign policy, social, protection of human rights, enhancing the legislation. So I would say that, let's say, an attempt to at least define certain policies on Crimea as a domestic task was envisaged in this strategy. And we believe, and let me also assure you that since the very first days of occupation, there was a huge request from the civil society to have this kind of document that would really bring the strategic vision on what we could do with the Crimean issue. The document consists of both public and classified parts, and the public will be, let's say, shared as soon as possible with our partners as our Ukrainian response within the Crimea Platform efforts. I will not stop in detail speaking about those consequences, both in terms of militarization and mass violations of human rights and international humanitarian law in Crimea. My colleague Anatolii has already mentioned that, and I hope that other speakers will also contribute to this course. I would just say that probably the most, let's say, the gravest concern is with the change of demography, because with this repressive reality that we can see for 7 years, where even those brave people who dare to say that Crimea is Ukraine may be detained for at least 5 years in the prison, with these repressions and political persecutions, when people with Ukrainian flags can be detained and spend years in the jail, we see that with this reality, Russia squeezes out Ukrainian citizens out of Peninsula, and from another hand, actively tries to change the demography and bring Russian citizens to the Crimean Peninsula, and at least 500,000 of Russian citizens moved in Crimea within this 6-7 years. For the peninsula, with 2.5 Ukrainian citizens, this is a great, let's say, this is a big number, I would say, of people. So forcible demographic change is something that I would really focus your attention to. And of course, forced conscriptions. Within these years, 28,000 of Ukrainians were conscripted to the Russian army. Those who, let's say, deny or tries to escape this forcible conscription, they may be also detained, and there are a bunch of criminal and administrative cases for not, let's say, following the conscription for the Ukrainian citizens. Political persecutions, cultural and political suppressions, the one factor that despite the order of the International Court of Justice to restore the access to the Ukrainian education or education in Ukrainian language and restore of the activities of self-governing body Majlis of Crimean Tatar people. Of course, Russia ignores these kind of decisions, and the rhetorics of Russian Federation is that Crimea lives under the will of Crimean people, beautiful life within the Russian reality, and we can see how different people, let's say, representing Crimea travel or in Zoom attend different international events, trying to bleach out the crimes of Russia and the Kremlin, and trying to convince you, dear colleagues, that the life in Crimea is rosy and beautiful, and that Russia donates a lot of money. It is true that really Russia invests a lot of money and efforts into Crimea and making Crimea a showcase of its glory. But we have to understand that every single infrastructure project in Crimea has a military course. Even the roads that has been actively built up in Crimea have the military course. So there is a strong attempt to legitimize the status quo in Crimea, and for this reason over 3,000 legal acts have been adopted in Russia in order to integrate Crimea into the Russian legal space. 10 illegal voting campaigns within 7 years had been taken place in Crimea, including the illegal referendum on amendments to the Russian constitution last year summer. Illegal expropriation and privatization of Ukrainian state-owned assets, and the latest case, probably the most grave, is the Ukrainian state enterprise Massandra winery, which is, I would say, a great brand of Ukraine, was acquired for almost nothing, for 70 millions of US dollars by those who are affiliated to the president of Russian Federation, to the companies of friends affiliated to the Russian president. And I should say that thousands of hectares of super soil had been sold for nothing. So the Ukrainian response within these, let's say, concerns and the consequences is the following. First, strategic vision, and then updating the legislation. And I'm very happy to state that our parliament is also very active on this track by registering in December 2020 the Interfraction Coalition of Crimea Platform. For today, we have over 40 members of parliament participating in the Crimea Platform parliament dimension, but I will show you the architecture of Crimea Platform a bit later. So the Crimea Platform is our response, and I believe that the idea of Crimean Platform is not something that only initiated by Ukraine, but something that should be supported by international community, because otherwise the Crimea Platform idea will not be elaborated as such. So strategic goal is the occupation of Crimea, and our purpose is to consolidate the efforts based on this strategic vision elaborated in our strategy, to invite our partners to share opinions and find response. What should we do all together to deoccupy Crimea? Because there is no recipe, there is no formula for that. And we believe that only in this kind of synergy, any kind of response can be born. The Crimea Platform and its architecture looks according to these metrics. So we have 4 dimensions of the Crimea Platform: heads of state and government, and for this cause we are initiating in 23rd of August 2021 the inaugural summit. During the summit we hope to adopt the Crimean Charter, which will be the final document of this summit that will actually declare the very basic policies of countries of non-recognition, non-recognition, that would formalize non-recognition policy, that will, let's say, focus on the crimes that has been taking place in Crimea, and that will bring together common efforts in terms of trying to deal with those crimes and trying to find, let's say, or to bring responsibility to Russia as the country that actually commits these crimes. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is a coordination body, and of course a certain network within MFAs of those countries joining the Crimea Platform, would be developed for the several reasons. First, fast response mechanism, then systematical informing and raising awareness on what has been happening in Crimea, and also the international expert network, which is very important, let's say, dimension of our efforts, where we believe that expertise and expert community can develop non-papers and documents and policy recommendations about Crimean tracks and our priorities, and we can share it as MFA with other MFAs of those countries joining the Crimean Platform. And of course, the parliament and interparliamentary dimension that can also focus on two tracks, domestic one and international. I will talk a little bit later about this. For the cause of Crimea Platform efforts, speaking and having in mind that we want to focus our attention not only on human rights violation and violation of international humanitarian law, but also militarization, we think that annual security forum for Azov, Black Sea and Eastern Mediterranean in Odessa can be a systematical and annual event just to bring together officials and experts to track the situation in the Black Sea. And with this, I think that, and I've been actually publicly saying this in many forums, that NATO has to also elaborate strategy on Black Sea and to find better response to those threats that we have in the Black Sea region. And I think that presence of NATO in the Black Sea should be permanent. So the summit, I've already talked about this. We are expecting high representation, the highest representation actually of those countries. We are now in the process of consultations with our partners. A lot of invitations have been sent, signed by my president to his vis-a-vis in different countries. So at the moment we are, let's say, collecting the feedbacks of our partners and expecting the understanding on who, what kind of representation will be during the summit. The parliament dimension is something that is of great importance for the cause of Crimea Platform. The national agenda, we believe, has to focus on different legislation and draft laws elaborated at the moment, which is about the strengthening of sanction mechanisms in Ukraine and the Ukrainian response within sanctions as a very practical tool of reaction, rights of IDPs and Kremlin's political prisoners, and there is a draft law on the criteria to define those who may be considered as political prisoners, because we have the situation where different Ukrainian official bodies have different, let's say, lists of those political prisoners, and we have to regulate this issue within our legislation. And of course, the other, let's say, draft laws. The international goals is to establish groups in parliamentary assemblies supporting the Crimea Platform, OSCE, NATO Parliamentary Assembly, Council of Europe, and we have already existing experience with the January session in Strasbourg in Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe, where our Ukrainian delegates initiated the launch of the group of Crimea Platform delegates, and we believe that same logic may be elaborated within NATO Parliamentary Assembly. Then, let's say, another important thing, that groups of friendship maybe also be the fundament for raising the discourse on Crimea. So this is at the moment envisaged by the members of parliament. We are in constant consultations with those leading deputies in the parliament, and at the moment working on a very concrete action plan how to follow those goals defined in this our strategy and presentation. The international expert network, probably also a super important track of our work, where we believe those who have expertise, and this is over 40 Ukrainian plus 40 international experts already, let's say, involved in our efforts. So we have already managed to initiate the launch of the Association of Experts, where those active working with Crimea will launch this association, and then MFA of Ukraine will sign a memorandum with this association, helping to find resources for their analytics, for research, for expert diplomacy, because we believe the main idea of this is not only to help us with the content, because we are, as the state, restricted in our monitoring missions in Crimea. We don't have any access to Crimea. We hardly can track the situation on the ground, something that can people do within their network with NGOs, human rights activists, and those who are the links with the occupied Crimea. And we believe that this expertise should be also developed within the expert network, something that we need strongly and something that we want to share with our partners. And also the, let's say, synergy logic, where we put together and match together Ukrainian experts and NGOs with the international community and international experts, thus galvanizing the analytics, research, and mutual, let's say, or common events, not in Kyiv, but in other capitals. So the idea is to get the Crimean cause out of only the Kyiv discourse or the national Ukrainian discourse, just to make it much more strong in terms of the discourse in other capitals. So this is at the moment also under the very active work of our MFA and the experts. The Crimea Platform priority areas, we define 5 priorities, which is about consolidation and non-recognition policy and about codification of this non-recognition policy, sanctions, proper implementation and strengthening of the sanction regime. We have EU, we have US, Canada, and some of the other countries launching the sanction after the occupation of Crimea. But we believe that this is something that we can work on more, because probably this is one of those limited and restricted instruments in diplomatic and political framework of our fight for Crimea. Security, including freedom of navigation, protection of human rights and international humanitarian law, and of course, overcoming negative consequences on economy and environment. And of course, the most dangerous is the environmental and ecological issues, where we see how Russia manipulates the water supply issue, where illegally Russia tries to cover their needs of water within their military causes by taking the underground waters, and this leads to the salinization of soil. And I believe this is something that we also have to focus on by launching analytics and information, what has been happening really in terms of this water supply issue and water resources, in terms of the illegal excavating of sand, illegal excavating of cultural heritage, and many more. And finally, my final and the last slide in my presentation on what the possible ways of NATO involvement into the Crimea Platform activities. Of course, in general and strategically, I think that the most strong response is the permanent presence of NATO in Black Sea, because this is probably the only safeguard and something that gives a real signal to Russia Federation that has been actively modernizing its military components in Crimea, that has been very active in terms of military exercises in the Black Sea, that actually dominates in the Black Sea. So we believe that the restriction should be there, and this is about NATO presence in the Black Sea and NATO strategy about the Black Sea. And besides this super task, we think that holding regular NATO-Ukraine Commission meetings, where we see as an opportunity for Ukraine to inform the partners about the developments in Crimea and those threats that we see caused by the Russian aggressive policy. Inviting the representatives of Ukraine as guests for the regular North Atlantic Council ministerial meetings, so this both foreign affairs and defense. Again, this serves the aim to keep the discourse and the opportunity to keep the discourse, engaging the NATO experts in activities of the Crimea Platform expert network opportunity. We see as the synergy of monitoring analytical endeavors, and we are ready to, let's say, launch the mediation between our experts and NATO experts to find those solutions that sometimes are very difficult to find, especially without common efforts. Making reference to the Crimean issue in the alliance's final documents, because it is about messages, signals, and it's a great factor that Crimean people track on everyday basis, because it is indeed very important. I remember I've been sharing it with some of the colleagues in Brussels recently. I've talked to Nariman Mamediminov. He is a civil journalist who spent 3 years in the jail for the video clip that he produced in 2013 about Islam. And he said that the only reason why he was not tortured was the publicity of his story. So we think that the publicity is something that serves one course, is to restrict Russia from crossing the red lines. And of course, what we expect is that the alliance consolidated support to the Crimea Platform initiative and participation of NATO Secretary General in the inaugural summit in Kiev, 23rd of August 2021. So with this, let me stop and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Deputy Minister Dzhaparova, for this really interesting presentation. You raised a lot of important issues, and thank you as well for elaborating on the Crimea platform, particularly the last point about how NATO could engage. I'm sure that James will pick up on some of these points when we get to his section. So now I'd like to move on with the rest of our speakers, but first I would just like to send a message to the audience, because I forgot at the beginning. You can ask a question by typing into the Q&A box or by clicking on the hand icon. I hope you'll have lots of questions. So now I'd like to turn to Mr. Kubilius, who is a great supporter of Ukraine, one of the leading voices in the European Parliament, and not just because he's chairman of EuroNest. So I'd be interested, Mr. Kubilius, to hear your views, I guess specifically on, what the EU could perhaps do more than it's doing now, vis-a-vis the situation in Crimea.
Well, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot very much, for inviting me to participate in this very important event. And definitely, situation in Crimea is where a lot of European members of European Parliament are feeling, sympathy with the people who are suffering, and also, where we understand what international crime was done by Kremlin authorities, with occupation of Crimea. I do not. Yeah. Second, realize when I see what Ukrainian government is doing with Crimea Platform, what Mrs. Dzhaparova, presented, it's really very important and very very good and very strong, and I would just congratulate and I would say that please continue and we shall try to be as solidar in your efforts as possible. I do not have any very how to say silver bullet or miracle solution how to get rid of Crimea occupation, despite the fact that I am also standing rapporteur on Russia. I see the problems which can stay for quite a period of time. Of course, I cannot imagine democratic Russia, which I still believe that it will happen. And still, despite, well, I am feeling myself very young, being in 60s, but I'm still hopeful that, we shall see. At least myself, I will see in my life, how Russia will turn back to democracy. I cannot imagine democratic Russia, not resolving how to bring back, Crimea to Ukraine, and how to get rid of that occupation, because that is not only the problem for Ukraine and for Europe itself. This is the biggest problem for Russia itself. Since really it became a litmus test, when Russia will get rid of its, some kind of post-imperial past. But it will take time, and I do not have any clear, scenario how it will go. But first of all, what I would like to stress, and what EU needs to do, and where really Mrs. Dzhaparova was speaking about very much. Crimea is a litmus test also for EU, how EU will be able to continue its non-recognition policy. I think that this is most important. At least as politician, I see that as most important what EU needs to do. It needs to continue its non-recognition policy. And why it's important, I can tell from our own example, from Lithuanian example. We were occupied by not by Russia, by Soviet Union, by Stalin back in 1940s. We stayed under that occupation for 50 years. All that time, with very small exemptions, all the West was keeping non-recognition policy of our occupation, with the leadership of the United States of America. And at the end, we know how it ended. It ended with some collapse of Soviet Union, and we got, our freedom. So non-recognition policy of Crimea occupation is a most important task for the West for time being. Just to keep that policy, just to keep it, without any temptations, any doubts, and so on and so on. So that's one thing. Second thing, which I would say, and I don't know, maybe that's exactly again it would be some idea, some proposal to Mrs. Dzhaparova, really to have to start to register, annually what kind of damages are done by occupation from one side to Ukraine, from another side to people who are living in Crimea by occupation. I don't know how how it should be done and what kind of international standards are for some kind of this evaluation of the damages, but that would be very important. Very important really to start to have clear register of all the damages which are done by occupation to the state of Ukraine, to the business of Ukraine, to the people who are suffering back in Crimea. I will not speak about military issues, since I think that there are people who know much better. But what I would suggest also, maybe I missed that point, I don't know, in your presentation, I would also look for possibility to have some kind of regular annual or semi-annual reports on human rights situation in Crimea towards European Parliament or to its specific specialized committees, DROA, for example, for human rights, or AFET for foreign affairs. That would keep this permanent attention towards situation in Crimea here in Brussels, at least inside of European Parliament. It can be really very, very regular tradition, not just accidentally know that somebody is coming from Ukraine, like you, Madam Dzhaparova, and you speak out, but just regular tradition, at least once a year, special report towards European Parliament on human rights situation in Crimea. That would be really, really very, very, very important to keep again this non-recognition policy alive. What I would say, and I think that we can have, and your experience on your experience and our experience on non-recognition of Crimea can have very important value towards some other issues. For example, non-recognition of not legitimate Lukashenko regime. How it should be established now. So non-recognition of Crimea is some kind of example how Western community should proceed. We can have even bigger issues with forthcoming so-called elections in Russia, Duma elections. My question always is very simple, what we shall do if we shall not be able to recognize those elections as legitimate ones, what it will mean. But that is a little bit outside of the topic on Crimea. But on Crimea, I would stress non-recognition policy of the West of the European Union, which we need to keep, permanent and without any weakening of that policy.
Thank you very much, and thank you for these really excellent recommendations, which I see everybody writing down, which is always a great sign. I want to move straight on now to our next speakers. I would ask, I have to get a bit tough now on timing, so I would ask 7 minutes maximum, if that's possible. And I'd like to start now with Rachel Denber to give us her, well-known expertise on the human rights situation and the biggest challenges vis-a-vis this in Crimea these days.
Thank you so much, Amanda. It's a pleasure to be on this panel with such distinguished speakers. Let me just start by saying that Human Rights Watch's researchers have been on the ground regularly in Crimea from the very beginning of the occupation, since before March 15th, actually, to investigate and report on human rights in Crimea for a variety of reasons. Obviously, we document human rights violations all around the world in all kinds of circumstances. So Crimea was obviously going to be quite important to us and continues to be. But also, as Ms. Dzhaparova said, it's really important for us to keep the human rights situation in Crimea on the international agenda. There are so many crises in the world. It's too easy for a very serious situation like we have in Crimea to diminish on the international agenda, and our job is to keep it prominent on the international agenda, to not let it fall. So we've been publishing just dozens of reports to make sure, based on our research, to make sure that the voices of people who are living through these abuses are heard widely in the world and by policymakers, and to amplify the work of very courageous lawyers and human rights defenders and others who are in Crimea, who are putting their safety and their liberty on the line to document human rights abuses there. I think other people have already said during this panel that Russia obviously thoroughly persecutes people in Ukraine who are critical of the occupation. It uses an arsenal of tools to do so: prison, false charges, threats, harassment, intimidation, unlawful deportation, barring people from entry. But Russia also, in doing so, and in other ways as well, Russia does not abide by the laws of occupation under the Geneva Conventions. So it is applying, which this is an occupation, and Russia, as an occupying power, has certain obligations, including to abide by the the Fourth Geneva Convention, the laws of occupation. That means that. So it doesn't abide by that by applying Russian laws. as opposed to Ukrainian laws, by including Russian laws that are repressive and discriminatory. It treats Ukrainians who didn't take Russian citizens, that don't take Russian citizenship, as foreigners in their own country, with, as Ms. Dzhaparova said, with consequences that harmfully disrupt their lives and also disrupt and manipulate the peninsula's demography. I also want to say that as an occupying power, Russia is also responsible for violations of international humanitarian human rights law that were committed from the very beginning, including in the process of carrying out the occupation. So whether it was by whether these violations were perpetrated by Russian forces or by their proxies. Ms. Dzhaparova at the beginning of her presentation remembered Rishat Akhmetov. That's the case a man who was disappeared and then later extrajudicially executed. It's a case that we'll never forget. But I just want to remind people that there, even according to the UN, there are still at least the number of cases of 11 cases of people who were forcibly disappeared during since the beginning of the occupation, who remain missing, and then other cases where people who were detained and forcibly disappeared, where they still have no justice for what happened to them. So, like I said, Russia is using a variety of tools to eradicate any sentiment opposing Russian occupation. Anyone who's criticizing Russia's actions in Crimea, it applies repressive Russian laws and also unjust Russian court rulings. And key among those are Russia's abusive extremism laws. So laws that would directly or indirectly equate any criticism of or opposition to the occupation as extremism. And this is a law that Russia used to ban the Majlis, the governing body of Crimean, representative governing body of Crimean Tatars, and related media and other groups. It's under Russia's vague extremism laws that they've detained human rights lawyers such as Emil Kurbedinov back in 2018, and based on the basis of those laws, they also threatened to strip him of his license to practice law. They threatened to disbar him. He's one of the most important lawyers now who's protecting the rights of people under their occupation. It's under extremism laws that the authorities have detained members of Crimean Solidarity, which is a very important group that provides in Crimea, that provides financial and legal and other assistance to Crimean Tatar families who have who are affected by all the roundups and criminal charges. And also just to add that under new Russian amendments on extremism, the definition of extremism has now been widened even more to include violation of Russia's territorial integrity, including alienation of parts of territory of Russian Federation. So the way we see this is, we see this as kind of, we see what the future can be, even though there have been many laws that have been used very flexibly by the Russian authorities to accuse people of, and penalize people for extremism charges. Now there's a new grounds for which they can be charged for extremism simply by claiming that Russia is simply by claiming that Crimea is Ukraine. Now this is directly a violation of Russia's extremism laws. The Russian authorities have been using completely groundless, unjustifiable terrorism charges as a convenient tool to stifle dissent and smear peaceful Crimean Tatar activists. And they do this by framing them as being affiliated with Hizb ut-Tahrir. Hizb ut-Tahrir is a controversial pan-Islamist movement that's banned in Russia as a terrorist organization, but is legal in Ukraine. So this is by going after people who, as supposedly, promoting or being part of Hizb ut-Tahrir, Russia's violating the law on occupation. Hizb ut-Tahrir, it seeks the establishment of a caliphate, but it doesn't espouse violence to achieve those goals. But these are, These are very serious charges that Russia is leveling against Crimean Tatars who are accused of Hizb ut-Tahrir affiliation. There have been 80 people so far who've been through the criminal justice system on these charges, 34 already sentenced. And even though not a single one of, even though none of these people are charged or even accused of planning, carrying out, or being part of any violent action, they draw prison sentences range up to 19 years. So these are very serious charges. Human Rights Watch has been documenting several waves in which the authorities have brought these unfounded terrorism charges against Crimean Tatar activists, including like heavily armed raids on their homes, torture of detainees, planting of evidence. And I think it's also important to, planting of evidence, also denying lawyers access to searches. I think it's also important to point out that in the recent waves of these criminal terrorism charges against Crimean Tatar activists, many of the activists who were targeted have been quite active in Crimean solidarity. Russia also uses entry bans to ensure the stifling of stifling of dissent. The most, I think, one of the first and most outrageous ones was banning Mustafa Jamilov from entry. He was who was the longtime head of the Mejlis, banning him from entry. They did that back in 2014, and they've just extended his ban for another 13 years. They've banned journalists, for example, Taras Ibragimov, banned him from entering until 2054. He's a journalist who, back to Human Rights Watch, has worked together with in order to document human rights violations in Crimea. And they've banned other journalists as well. I think another thing I'd like to point out about how Russia's using its extremism laws and judicial rulings unlawfully in Crimea has been the ban on Jehovah's Witnesses. Jehovah's Witnesses were banned as an extremist organization in Russia, and currently there are hundreds of people facing criminal charges for their involvement in Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia. And now in Crimea, there are now 4 people in pretrial detention. 2 people have already been convicted just on charges of being a Jehovah's Witness, being members of the Jehovah's Witnesses community and continuing Jehovah's Witnesses religious activities. I just want to point out that people have been convicted both for being members of Jehovah's Witnesses or people who were convicted on charges of being allegedly connected to Hizb ut-Tahrir. They are all many of them are serving their prison terms outside of Crimea. So they're transferred outside of Crimea to Russia to serve the prison terms. This is also a serious violation of the law of occupation. While we're talking about religion, just want to mention there's also growing pressure on the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. It's been facing the loss of some of its largest places of worship in Crimea, and also the Russian authorities are going after mosques in Crimea that operate outside the framework of the Russia-backed Crimean Muslim Board. So we have people fined. There are imams and others who are fined under Russia's anti-missionary laws, raids on mosques. And I think I have maybe 1 more minute, right, Amanda? So the 2 other sets of violations I wanted to flag that are just open violations of the law on occupation. I think Emine Dzhaparova already mentioned it. This is Russia's continued use of conscription in Crimea. I just want to flag that this is a blatant violation of international humanitarian law. Russia is occupying Crimea. Occupying powers do not, the Geneva Convention specifically forbid an occupying power from compelling residents of the areas that they occupy from serving in the occupiers' armed forces. And yet Russia continues to conscript, as Ms. Dzhaparova said. This is something that Human Rights Watch documented in a report in 2019. We documented at least 63 guilty verdicts in which Russian authorities, Russian courts convicted people on draft evasion charges. between 2017 and 2019, and we're sure that the number is much higher because our research is based only on those court records that we were able to access. Most people were fined for draft evasion, but draft evasion also can be, it's an offense that also draws a prison penalty. Also, the second key, extremely important violation of the law, the law of occupation is that, again, Russia made Ukrainians foreigners in their own homes, and they deport, forcibly transfer people who refuse to get Russian, Russian identity documents. I think, I think that the recommendations that that some of the other speakers had to keep attention on Russia's violations of human rights and international humanitarian law that were articulated by other members of of this panel, I can only endorse them, and I really hope that when the Crimea Platform takes off, that that human rights is a key feature of the discussions. We have to keep the human rights violations and the need to restore human rights in Crimea high on the international agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. I mean, you painted a very ugly picture, frankly speaking, and it seems that Russia is able to do what it wants without actually paying very small price, if any price at all. Well, that's how it seems. That's how it seems to me, at least so far. Perhaps there's more that can be done. But now I'd like to hand immediately over to James. I would ask you as well, James, if you could stick to about 6 or 7 minutes tops, this would be wonderful. We heard from one of the other speakers, the long age request that I've heard so many times, why doesn't NATO elaborate a Black Sea strategy? It would be nice if you could respond to that, but also perhaps on some of the recommendations that were given by Mrs. Emine as well.
So thank you for the opportunity to speak, and don't worry, I'll definitely keep to my time. Let me start by expressing my respect for this initiative, but also to the Deputy Foreign Minister, Dzhaparova, for continuing to draw attention to this issue. I think we all understand how important this is. But as I said to her, as we were talking about when she was here the last time, I think one of the main concerns I have is addressing not just the details of what we just heard, for example, of the human rights violations, but actually a sort of common perception that Crimea is lost, that it's too late, we should focus on other issues. And I hear that not just in the public, but frankly, I hear it growing a little bit at political levels in senior members of the international civil service. So I think it's really important that we fight back against that basic idea, and then highlight some of the many issues that we've heard, and I won't detail them. They're I think, well understood and really very serious. But I took good note when Deputy Foreign Minister Dzhaparova gave her list of things we should do. So I'll just comment on each one of those because I know when I'm being given direction. So first, keep attention on the issue. We will do that, and we just discussed that. Let me just say that the initiative of the Crimean Platform has received very wide support here amongst the NATO ambassadors. Second, to maintain a strong political principled position with regard to Crimea. And our colleague from the EU, Mr. Kubilius, mentioned it. Let me say from a NATO point of view, we're just as clear and just as strong. So all of our statements mention Ukraine as part, Crimea as part of Ukraine. When we schedule NATO-Russia Council meetings with our counterparts from the Russian Federation, it is our principled position that Ukraine is always the first issue on the agenda. And we never compromise from that, even though it's not necessarily Russia's favorite first agenda topic. All of our political declarations restate that NATO allies recognize Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. That will not change. So from a political point of view, you can count on NATO. Then in terms of practical steps, I think we share a lot of the assessment from the Deputy Minister of Defense about the really rapid and substantial militarization of Crimea. And that's an issue, first and foremost, for Ukraine. It's an issue for the Black Sea, but it's also an issue beyond the Black Sea, because Crimea is a sort of aircraft carrier now being used to support operations that go into the Eastern Mediterranean. So it's an issue for everybody, not just for Ukraine. So we do our best to provide support, first and foremost, to Ukraine. So we have extensive programs of support from a NATO point of view to help Ukraine put its armed forces more and more on a more capable footing, not direct support to combat operations, but general reform and upgrade that includes to the Navy, which is a little bit smaller than it was before 2014. And we've taken decisions just recently to do more. I would also highlight that many allies on a bilateral basis have major programs of support to Ukraine as well that go in the same direction. And my own country is one of those. Then I would say, draw your attention to the fact that we do actually have a Black Sea strategy and a Black Sea approach. And this has two elements. One is more support to allies, Romania and Bulgaria in particular. Turkey's quite robust all on its own, but we provide support to them as well. But there is a program of support to enhance NATO's presence and capability in both of these countries. Many allies, fly fighter aircraft and bombers and provide training, put facilities there. So we're making sure that we are present in the Black Sea. We also have an extensive program of naval operations, but so do NATO allies. So you will have seen, for example, I think it was the USS Donald Cook was there recently. So many allies are cycling ships through the Black Sea. I would add, though, that we have a Black Sea cooperation program with Ukraine and Georgia. And those who follow NATO, hopefully all of you will have seen that we've had now a series of ministerial meetings on Black Sea security with high-level representation from Ukraine and Georgia, which is great. But we also have dedicated programs of support in a Black Sea context, meaning programs to help both countries enhance what we call situational awareness, their ability to see what's going on in the Black Sea, which of course relates to their security. So technical and professional support, support to building up coast guards, support to building up navies, and better communications so that we can exchange information. And we are regularly exchanging strategic assessments. What do we see? And what can we do about it? And here we really welcome the contribution from Ukraine and from Georgia. Frankly, they see as much, if not more than we do, not necessarily for very welcome reasons, but what we do welcome here at NATO is how much insight that provides to us. And we can then together design programs to deepen cooperation and support to these countries. So just to wrap it up, we do a lot with Ukraine. We do a lot in the Black Sea context for allies and also with our partners. And we will stick with our principled position. I will do my part, and I think NATO will more broadly, to keep attention on Crimea, what's happening in Crimea, that Crimea is part of Ukraine and will stay that way. That will be a position NATO doesn't waver from. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James, and thank you for keeping to the 6 minutes. Highly appreciated. I want to quickly now go to the last speaker, to Joanna, to hear your thoughts on some of the subjects that we've touched on, and also perhaps offer your expertise, because I know you're a leading expert on everything to do with Ukraine, on the current policies of the EU towards Crimea, and if they're enough or what more could be done.
Yes, thank you. So I'll be very brief to leave time for questions. So I'm very happy that we are having this event, because unfortunately hardly anyone mentions Crimea anymore in Western policy debates. It's become a rather niche topic. So the idea of the Crimea Platform, I find it excellent. It's a really great initiative, and I do hope that it will get ever greater support from the EU and its member states. because I really think we need to come back to the basics and remember what happened in March 2014. It was an illegal annexation of a part of territory of Ukraine. It shook Ukraine to the core, and it shook the European security system to the core. And because of that great shock, we had also great mobilization in the EU and also across the Atlantic to impose sanctions. That was quite an achievement, but then it was overtaken by other events, by the Donbass, and then soon both Crimea and the Donbass largely were also, well, forgotten amongst other crises, most recently, obviously, by the pandemic. So now I think it's really important to reinforce EU policy on Crimea again, the policy of non-recognition. Mr. Kubilius mentioned that this is really the key EU policy and it needs to be kept alive. I would go further and say that it just doesn't need to be just alive, but needs to be alive and kicking. It needs to be a more dynamic policy, not something that is mentioned annually in a statement from the High Representative of the EU or here and there, but it's something that has to come up all the time. So I have written about the idea of having a new position in the EU of the EU Special Representative for Crimea, which I think would be a much needed position. We have one for the Caucasus, for the Georgian crisis, and we don't have one for Crimea or Donbass. So I think it would be an excellent initiative to increase Europe's voice on the matter, to keep it very high on the agenda. That would be a very concrete step to take. It's this flexible policy instrument that the EU has and could hopefully be instated to really reinforce the non-recognition policy everywhere, and to hopefully enlarge it, because not all the states across the planet follow that policy, and that person could hopefully strengthen it further and keep coming back to it and make sure that it's a thorn that keeps stinging those who don't support it. So just this briefly to leave room for questions and comments.
Thank you, Joanna, and thank you for being so short. So now I'd like to turn over to some of the questions that we've got here. I want to start with one from Dmitro Shurko, who's basically asking, against the background of Russia's, extremely aggressive rhetoric these days, he has two questions. The first one is to Deputy Minister Petrenko. He's asking whether Ukraine is ready to react to the military aggression from two directions at the same time, so both in occupied Donbass and in Crimea. And the second question is to you, James. How does NATO assess the reality of the scenario of Russian full-scale aggression against Ukraine this spring, and what actions are made to protect the security of neighboring NATO countries? So I'll start with those two questions. Deputy Minister Petrenko, would you like to start? If you're there.
Yes, I should be here with you. Well, dear colleagues, first of all, thank you very much for all support in your remarks for Ukraine and for the cause of the occupation of Crimea, taking into account all instruments and resources that you might have in your possession. This is all Ukraine needs. And that's exactly the case why my fellow colleague Emine mentioned synergy. We have to build a synergy and we have to consolidate resources, because Ukraine, as one of the nations in the Black Sea Basin, needs international support, and we are committed to develop our partnership to the extent it's possible and to the extent it would solidify our defense capacity inter alia to neutralize any possible escalation. Now back to question, and I understand that in the interest of time, I have just a couple of minutes to respond. Simple answer is that Ukraine is getting ready to prevent any further threats to our territorial integrity and sovereignty. We all understand the combat potential Russia has and so far accumulated on occupied peninsula. But at the same time, we are doing all we can through our military activities and national resources to make sure that if there is any manifestation of further aggression from the south direction towards Ukraine, we would take adequate measures to protect Ukrainian people and Ukrainian soil. That's possibly the best answer I could give you. If you recall the figures and facts I provided in my presentation, you could make very simple analysis. What are the proportions? Proportions on the peninsula, proportions of Russian forces on continental part of Russia, which could potentially be used to threaten the genuine national security interests of Ukraine should such political decision be taken. Therefore, political synergy, consolidation of resources, international presence in the Black Sea, further assistance to Ukraine to proceed with defense reform, to build modern capabilities, strategic perspective of Ukraine to become part of collective security organizations. Those are pieces which should fit together to give you a complete answer that yes, Ukraine is ready to prevent any escalation from multiple directions. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. I will now give the floor to James for that the second part of that question, please.
Thanks, and I'll be extremely brief. I don't think certainly I'm in a position to assess what the Kremlin might decide to do, and I can't say I've always predicted what they were going to do in the past, including when it came to Crimea. So I won't speculate, but I can say this. The principal reason, the proximate cause for a huge shutdown in NATO-Russia cooperation was what happened in Crimea. And of course, it led to sanctions in the European Union, which haven't lifted ever since. And in my view, what happened in Crimea, what continues to happen in Crimea and in Donbass, has been useful in one sense because it shone a wider light on what Russia had been doing prior to that. And if you ask our Georgian friends, they would say, if you'd listened, you'd see that it's very similar. I say all this because it would seem to be certain that any further Russian aggression in Ukraine will just further consolidate the frustration, the view that Russia is destabilizing the neighborhood, that it's very difficult to find ways to encourage Russia to come back into compliance with international law, meaning that more sanctions have to be put in place, more steps have to be taken. So I'm quite convinced it's profoundly not in Russia's interest to take any further steps in Ukraine, and that it is in Russia's interest to come to a solution which recognizes international law and Ukraine's territorial integrity. When it comes to allies, there should be no doubt. We have a profound commitment to defending all allies. We have the forces in place. We have the plans in place. That is definitely a clear position on the part of the allies.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to put another couple of questions here. The first one is from Mikola Skira, who's asking, in the case of a successful Crimea deoccupation, what's going to happen to the Russians that have been moved there? Are they going to be given Ukrainian citizenship or sent back to Russia? Perhaps I can ask you to answer that, Deputy Minister Dzhaparova. I'll take another question here as well from Valentine Lafont. who is asking, in the context of Crimea and Donbass, how could the EU become a security provider in these areas? I mean, shifting away from a civil power to a soft military power. I think this could go to you, Mr. Kubilius, and also to you, Joanna. And then a third question from Taras Kuzio, who's asking, is it not time to demand Russian opposition should condemn Crimea's occupation? Nemtsov did condemn it, but Navalny has not. So I'll leave that for somebody to answer as well. But I'll give the floor now to you, Mrs. Deputy Minister Dzhaparova.
Thank you, Amanda. I will be very brief. There is inner discussion, domestic discussion on what the transitional justice will be after the occupation. So at the moment, within the strategy implementation, our active stakeholders like Ministry on Reintegration and Deoccupation and the special mission of our president to Crimea have been elaborating the transitional justice draft law, which will be adopted by the parliament, and that will provide very clear understanding of what is the future of Crimea for the people, I mean. So, and as far as it's a domestic discussion, it's not yet clear what will be the rules. I cannot share it with you, but I can assure you that this will be a civilized way how to deal with the reintegration process in terms of regulating relationship with those living in Crimea and so on.
Okay, thank you. I'll turn the floor now to you, Mr. Kubilius.
Well, perhaps I will not give very precise answer to what kind of EU soft military power EU can use in really bringing security towards both Crimea and Donbass. I know something about EU soft power, but about EU military power, I am quite skeptical. So EU soft power really, which could be much stronger in support for Ukraine integration, could have some kind of influence around, both on Crimea people and also people in Donbass and even Russia. So that is what we are arguing always, that Ukrainian integration is not only needed for Ukraine, itself, but it's really very important soft geopolitical power of EU. Second, I am always, still being, newcomer to EU, Parliament, to European Parliament. I'm always a little bit critical about EU foreign policy, architecture, which, as you know, perfectly is very much dependent on EU member states and centralized authority of Borrell or whatever, is very limited. And that sometimes is good, but sometimes it's really very, very pity that EU has no strong centralized, foreign policy or security policy instruments. And that is, for example, I would be very much in favor that EU should participate in Minsk process, in Normandy process, as EU, not just through Germany and France, but as EU. That could be, really possibilities and for EU really to bring some kind of added value for I don't know how to call it, soft security policy or soft, military power into those two regions like Donbass and Crimea. But first of all, I would urge really, and I'm always doing this, EU to be much more ambitious, effective in its integration and enlargement policy. If for time being, full membership is not possible, let's talk about what we call in our circles here with new SEPS report, we talk about anti-chamber membership. All the benefits of membership without presence in institutions. But at least let's give for Ukraine clear way forward. And that could be, a really big breakthrough also in in soft security policy of the whole region.
Thank you. I give the floor to you now, Joanna.
Yes, so I don't see the EU as a military soft power either for now, but there are diplomatic instruments that the EU could apply more proactively. So it was quite remarkable that from the US we had a special envoy to Ukraine at one point, not anymore at the moment, but there was one when there wasn't one from the EU. So this is a position that the EU could consider, as well as the EU special representative for Crimea, and generally have more people whose jobs actually really are full-time in Brussels to deal with Ukraine and Crimea, and that keep the issue on the agenda, and that coordinate European policy on those issues. That would already be big progress. And now, of course, the EU has a problem on its general policy on Russia. There will be a summit very soon to discuss that after the debacle of Josep Borrell's visit in Moscow. That is very much in demand, this kind of discussion, and everybody is wondering what should be the policy on Russia. And I believe that Crimea should be part of that policy. It should be central to understand what is the problem between the West and Russia at the moment. And it's, while devising the new policy, it should always be kept in mind. So the new policy and more diplomatic and foreign policy tools are very welcome, but I don't see any military actions for now or military missions.
Okay, thank you so much. Rachel, would you like to comment on any of those points, perhaps the issue of the Russians that are living in Crimea, what could happen to them when Crimea is deoccupied? What would your recommendations be?
That's a very interesting question. I think that the Dzhaparova's answer was a very good one when she said that the policy would be civilized. Look, that's a tough issue because there is the law of occupation, but there are also human rights principles. So I think that the approach would depend. There would have to be an individualized approach. I think that there shouldn't be categorical decisions made about all people who moved from the Russian Federation to Crimea after 2014. I think it would depend on how much time they lived there. I think it would depend on whether they were born there and the like. But I think that I think the answer is that the approach should be from both. The point of departure for the approach should be both international humanitarian law and the law on occupation, but also Ukraine's human rights obligation. So it would mean an individualized approach.
Thank you very much. I'm aware that we've slightly run over time, but as we started slightly late, I would like to give the Deputy Minister Dzhaparova, the last word. Perhaps commenting, as you had asked earlier, on the recommendations that were made by Mr. Kubilius. His ideas. So the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. I will be very short, not keeping you too long. Let me first of all thank you really from the bottom of my heart for being active, for contributing to this discussion, because I believe as soon as we define our strategic goal to deoccupy Crimea, tactically it is crucial not to allow the issue to slip down. And of course it happens, and there are objective causes for this. We are living in a turbulent conjuncture and surrounding, and many things happening. And of course our task and my task on this position and also as the one who lived in Crimea and who kind of lives it through very personally, how to find those recipes, because as Andrius said, there is no magic and silver bullet. There is no this bullet. It's all about our synergy. It's all about our common effort. It's all about routine and everyday work on what to do and what more could be done in order to solve really unsolvable issues sometimes. And of course, if you ask me what EU, for example, efforts could be, and we've been also requesting the EU side with that, because within our strategy, we tried to foresee and to consider participation of our partners on what more could be done. And actually, our request was to actually first elaborate on those personal sanctions within the human rights global EU sanction mechanism. And we passed the list of persons whom we believe responsible for the human rights violation in Crimea for the EU side in December 2020. And also we requested to launch the special representative on Crimea, because we have the instruments of and the mandate of special representatives on human rights, Mr. Gilmore, and also the Caucasus issue. But we believe that Crimea is much more than only human rights violations. So we think that special mandate for Crimea has to be envisaged with the person and a staff to come up with also reports on human rights. Speaking about the strategic things, of course, for Ukraine, everything that serves, of course, to make Ukraine much more resilient, to strengthen our army, to see and to know if there is a clear perspective to membership action plan, if there is a clear perspective in terms of our EU integration, because we define it and we also, let's say, elaborated it within our constitution. This serves one goal, including the occupation, because of course, as soon as we understand that non-bloc status of Ukraine didn't serve the cause of that Russia was willing to sell, that if NATO enlarges and Ukraine will be a part of NATO, Russia will respond. But Russia responded, and actually Russia did aggressive actions without us being a member of collective defense alliances. So I think it's still the same. The question is still the same. If there is a will and if there is a readiness to accept Ukraine and to integrate Ukraine as the part of European market, European defense and security sector, and many more. So with this, let me stop. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much. I have to draw this meeting to a close now, so I would really like to thank all of you for taking part in this really great discussion. Obviously, I think we would all like to see Crimea deoccupied as soon as possible, and Georgia as well, if I might add that. Hopefully, sooner rather than later. And I do agree with all of the speakers that, it's really important that the international community, the EU and the US, continue to be very focused on the situation in Crimea, because there is always the, other burning issues, on the EU's agenda. But the situation there is, it's atrocious, and it deserves far more attention, at least in my opinion, from the West. So thank you all for joining us. A big thanks, particularly from our guests from Kiev today. It was really a pleasure to have you here. And many thanks again to the mission of Ukraine to NATO for this excellent cooperation. EPC will continue to follow developments in Ukraine very closely. So I look forward to seeing you all at other events. And thank you as well to the audience for joining us today and giving your questions. So all that remains to say is have a great afternoon and evening. And until the next time.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.